Hi everybody, I'm going to be reviewing 3 tents today. The Hyperlite Mountain Gear Echo 2, the ZPacks Duplex, and the Big Agnes Fly Creek HV UL2. At the time of this video, I believe that all of these 3 tents are the most up-to-date models. The HV model was released quite recently, and this was purchased new in 2016. This is the 2016 ZPacks Duplex, which includes the flex tent attachment points for it to become freestanding. And as far as I know, this is the most up-to-date model of the Echo 2 shelter, although this is not, as far as I know, a 2016 production model. I believe it's late 2015. So I'll be going into more detail of each of these tents individually, starting with the ZPacks Duplex, then going into Hyperlite Mountain Gear Echo 2, and finally ending with the Big Agnes Fly Creek. And I'll be doing setup of each of these tents, although my camera is out of batteries for my setup of the Big Agnes, so unfortunately you won't see me set that up. Alright, so you can see I have it pitched up here. I had a little bit of trouble pitching it up because the soil on this side is fairly loose, so when I tensioned up the other pole, it just ripped the stake out on this side. So lesson learned, keep a little bit of slack in the guidelines for the poles when you're setting them up, and then you can just adjust that after you have the whole tent up. So you can see there's my cat here helping me out. As you can see, I set it up a little bit differently than how it's recommended on the ZPacks website and how I've seen some other people do it. So what I do is first I set these 2 stakes out. I set them as close to 45 degrees out from the corner as I can and get this sort of end here fairly taut. Then what I do is I go to the other side. I get this side about as taut as I can, go out 45 degrees, but then move back about 4 to 6 inches and do the same on this side. And I find that extra slack then sort of helps me set up the poles and already tensions the poles fairly well, so I don't need to worry about the poles falling down, except for a case like this. And I found that works well, other than as opposed to setting them up 45 degrees, then putting up one pole and then adjusting for that. It's definitely a bit more of a kind of pain-free approach. So as you can see, on one side here I've set it up open, on the other side I've set it up closed. And this is a wonderful tent. It has a ton of air circulation, and I found that even when it's raining lightly I can leave both the doors open, because you can see here when you roll the doors up it allows for a bit of a gutter, so when rain hits the walls of the tent, instead of falling out onto the mesh door, it actually gets directed into these channels and then gets directed away from the vestibule. So unless it's raining really hard or you're in a really exposed site, you can actually leave one or even both of the doors open. But when it does rain hard enough, I have the other side set up more in storm mode. You can see that there's a toggle here that keeps the doors together even in high wind. It's relatively close down to the ground. You can keep a lot of gear down here. You can easily keep 1 or 2 backpacks just in this one vestibule, and if I'm hiking by myself it's particularly useful because I can just keep my gear in the rear vestibule that's covered and then have this entrance here just for entering and exiting the tent, so I don't need to worry about my boots or my pack or anything else getting in the way. And of course, often what I'll do is I'll stake out just one of the doors on this side and then the opposing door on this side, so it gives me some more privacy, still allows for airflow. And yeah, it's kind of a good compromise between the 2 options here. So you can see the tent is pretty palatial in the interior. It's certainly enough for 1 person and can definitely accommodate 2. I've used kind of it for both arrangements during hikes. For 2 it can sometimes get a little bit iffy. I mean, you're going to be, you're not going to have too much privacy. You'll have maybe a couple inches between sleeping mats, so you better make sure you like the person if you're going to be sharing it with them. But for one person, this is absolutely palatial. What you can do is you can stake up the poles even higher, get more of the bathtub floor off the ground, and yeah, and still have plenty of room. If it were raining hard enough, I could easily keep my pack in here. I could keep yeah, pretty much all my gear in here and still have more than enough room to sleep and toss and turn. And what's interesting about this tent as opposed to the Echo 2 that we'll be seeing in the future is this is sort of, I don't know how you would call it, but sort of like a self-leveling bathtub floor. So by default, when there's no weight in here, this is just completely loose. So you can see, I mean, it doesn't look nice. There's no sort of staked out neat corners. But once you're in there, once you have some weight in there, some gear in there, it pulls the corners down, and that's what creates the bathtub floor. I found that's quite interesting. It's a nice sort of streamlined design because you only really need then 4 stakes at the corners. You don't need a stake for the walls, and then also a stake to keep this down. And like I said before, if this, I mean, right now we have like a good 6 inches. I have it staked out fairly wide, just that's how I like to keep it by default. But if it were really, really rainy, or if we're playing it rather conservatively with the weather, I could then stake up the poles a bit higher and then really get like a full 8 inches, and I've seen some people stake it up even higher. Of course, the compromise there is then you have less interior room, but you know, worth it over getting wet. What you can do here on the sides, and what I didn't do for this video, is you can then put up additional stakes here, and as you can see, that pulls the middle of these sort of walls taut, gives you a bit more headroom on the interior. I'll sometimes do that just for my head area, but I rarely do it for my feet, especially if I'm sleeping alone. If it's really raining and I'm worrying about my sleeping bag touching the sides, I can just kind of sleep a little bit more diagonally and I won't have trouble. Yeah, I just really, really like this color. This is a really great color. It sort of sets up pretty beautifully for photos. I can pretty much set this up anywhere and it's gonna look nice and dramatic in its setting. The one issue about Cuben fiber, so this isn't this tent, but just Cuben fiber in general, is that it is fairly translucent. Even from here, slightly hard to tell, but you can start to see the bathtub floor. And if I were to throw any gear in there, particularly my sleeping bag, which is yellow, you would definitely see that. So if privacy is sort of an utmost concern to you, then I would go for either the thicker Cuben fiber, this is the thinner option, or I would go for the camo, which seems to be the most translucent. No, yeah. And yeah, that can present some problems. I've been at camps where people are walking around with their headlamps at dark, and the light just goes straight through the tent. I mean, I've been woken up several times within people who may not understand that the light really just gets through this tent or don't care. But if you want a nice uninterrupted and sort of very private sleep, then Cuben fiber in general and this tent may not be for you. That aside, this is an incredibly light tent. This is the lightest of the 3 options that I'll be showing you. It's very streamlined design. It knows what kind of tent it wants to be, and it does it well. And yeah, it really just comes down to whether this is the right tent for you. The one advantage of this tent is this is actually the only tent that, with the added flex poles that ZPacks sells, can actually become a fully freestanding tent. So you see, this is the newest model. Has these toggle points right here, also toggle points here at the apexes, and that allows you to buy these poles that essentially then just crisscross orthogonally across the tent there and are sort of self-tensioning, and actually then can raise the tent up for what I understand to be a fairly freestanding design. So if you're not one to carry poles along, or if you'd like some versatility, then that might be an option for you. Of course, that's going to add, I want to say, $150 or so on top of the already rather expensive base price. So it's your wallet and your decision. And one more thing to point out, just for the airflow, is that the airflow isn't only kind of bolstered by these doors here. If you really are in full store mode and have all the doors closed, you can see along the sides here, there's mesh. Oh, this is pretty hard to show. Yeah, there's mesh there along the sides, along here. So even with all the doors closed, you still have airflow that's coming up under the tent through here. Of course, that's might not be sufficient airflow. The one downside about this tent, at least in my opinion, is that if you're in full store mode, there's no real sort of vents or sort of airflow possibility. It would have been nice to maybe have some sort of venting at the apexes. I've seen that before in tarp tents, and sort of pyramid design tents, where like even when all the doors are closed, then you still have sort of a rigid flap that sort of allows airflow, at least for the hot air, your breath, condensation to escape from. I haven't actually used it in a storm that warranted a full storm mode, so I can't say for sure how bad the condensation would get. People have said that it's fairly good, so I might just be sort of overstating my worries, but that would be one potential downside to the tent. Yeah, other than that, like I said, this tent is a beautiful design. Might be a bit excessive if you're not really planning on doing a lot of hiking, or if you're not planning on doing a through hike. For what this tent offers, and raising concerns about its durability, might not make sense for your average car camper, or even for your weekend warrior, unless you're really worried about your weight, if you have bad knees for instance, and every gram counts, then this might be worth it. Alright, so just to give you a sense of how spacious this is, in the interior you have these really nice rainbow doors, allow for easy entrance and exit. You can see here, I can lie, there's plenty of enough room for another person, plenty of room for my gear. If I really want, I can sleep diagonally for some added headroom here. I'm about 6'1" or 6'2", so yeah, if you're even, 6'3", I would say you're more than enough set. I have plenty of room here when I lie between my head, I'd say like a good 6 inches, and if I were to make this skyline here taut, I would get even more elevation. And likewise, my feet aren't touching the other end of the tent. I would not be worried even in heavy rain, even if condensation builds up on the interior here of the two walls, I would not be worried that it would get on my sleeping bag. Yeah. And one more thing I just want to point out is just how much headroom there is in this tent. Two people could easily sit in this tent, play cards, talk. Even when I'm sitting upright, I still have a solid 6 inches here to play around with. So yeah, I say as far as sort of standard of living goes in this tent, or livability maybe is a better term, this I would say is a fairly high score. With the side accessibility, you're not crawling over anybody if you're sharing this tent, and with the dual walls, gives you versatility which side you want to go out if you want to store your gear on one side or the other. You can see between the fly and the tarp, there's like a 6 and in some places maybe 8 inches of leeway between the two. So even if there's significant condensation on the tarp, you'll see that it almost never, except for maybe at points along sort of the ridge line here, almost never makes contact with the tarp. It also allows for very, very good airflow. I can already see this having a lot less condensation issue than I was worried about the duplex having, where if you really have it in store mode, there's really no airflow aside for below the tent along the periphery. You can see here you have that, except you have significantly more because of the catenary cut. So at points it's nearly a foot off the ground, which allows for a lot more airflow. But because of the large bathtub floors here, I would say those are also nearly a foot. I foresee little to no danger of any splashback, except in the most severe of storms. And you can see in the back here, which isn't tied down, you have a solid rear wall, which means that if it's really, really raining, you won't need to worry about any splashback getting actually into the mesh inner. And you also have a bit of a gap between where the catenary tarp ends and where the beginning of the inner begins. I would say that's also at least a foot. So similarly to what we saw in the duplex, if you have really inclement weather, you can see here, I mean, even if the rain's coming in at like a fairly steep angle from the top, I mean, you really need to start kind of bending down before you even begin to see the mesh inner. Don't know if that's clear on my iPhone. I apologize again, not using my better camera. You can also see, comparing the two, might actually be better to go on the other side, that the Echo 2 has a much lower profile than does the ZPacks. And while that means there's less livability on the interior, as I'll show you in a second, it also means that the wind shedding capabilities of the Echo 2 are potentially a bit stronger than they are for the duplex, which does have a fairly large uninterrupted wall there. I can see if you're in kind of exposed plains areas, I'm thinking particularly of the UK or in Norway, for instance, I can see potential issues, or if you're above the tree line, I can see potential issues pitching it and then worrying about it getting knocked down by high winds, or it getting sort of stressed or torn. I haven't heard of that happening. This is just total conjecture. Please let me know if my fears are unwarranted. But nonetheless, this does have a bit of a lower profile, and a bit of a longer profile too, as you can see here. Yeah, and it's also it's like the ZPacks Duplex. A nice simple tent. It's certainly a more involved setup process, partly because I'm doing this for the first time, but I think in general there's more tie-out points. You need to attach the interior to the exterior if you're willing to do that, which I think most people who are looking at sort of low weight, high performance shelters like these are willing to do, then I don't think that should be a problem for you. They are different shelters. I'd say this is more of a versatile shelter, but also mostly in theory. I think that effectively, for this to be even a comparable shelter to the duplex, you really need to use all of the components in conjunction with each other, with possibly the exception of the beak. I think you can forgo the beak unless it's just really, really bad weather, or if you want a covered vestibule for your gear. Yeah. Let me set up the beak quickly. Alright, so here's a view from the interior of the tent facing out the front door. Just on a first impression, again, this is the first time I'm setting the tent up, so please keep that in mind. It does feel a bit more claustrophobic than the duplex in that you have this ridge line that's running pretty low compared to the duplex along the entire tent, and then you have it slope off on either side, which really diminishes any sort of interior space or sense of sort of open space that you achieve with the duplex, particularly with its sort of panoramic doors that can open and really give you kind of a views on either side. So here you just have a view out the front here. To either side you can see there's the mesh netting, and then about 6 inches away is the tarp. And you can see, if you look down, you can see there's a gap here. You can see where it's tied out. And there is a bit of airflow. There's wind rustling through right now. That's not coming through the door, and it's sort of carrying up under here through this living space and then down through the other side. This is, here, let me switch around here to the other side where I was before. You can see this tent, like the duplex, can easily hold 2 people, particularly if you have the ends staked down like you're supposed to. So you can see this tapering here. It's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to be flat like it is if my foot's over here. So it does give you a bit of space. I would say in terms of just footprint, square footage, I would say it's fairly comparable to the duplex. I would say they're almost exactly the same in that respect. The difference being, as you can see, if I'm staking out the corner with my foot, so to speak, and then lying down, there's significant tapering off on either side. So if I were sharing this tent with another person and was forced to sleep on the corner here, like I was saying before, it does feel a little bit more claustrophobic than I would personally like. Just because even if I bend my knees up, let's say I'm reading or, want to just stretch a little bit, I immediately touch the netting. Now, this isn't necessarily the case if I have the tent just myself. If I'm right below the ridge line, I can easily sort of stretch, or even towards the front of the tent, I can even sort of lean back with my head up. I certainly can't sit cross-legged with the bug tent in. You can see here, sorry I'm sweating, it's pretty humid. I'm sort of leaning back casually right now, if you can see that, and my head's already nearly touching the tent. And this inner is flush with the catenary tarp. So, alright, so here's a view of the inside of the Echo 2 with the beak fully closed, just to give you a sense of how large the vestibule is. You can see there's my trekking pole for scale. It's not a whole lot of room. It would be enough for, your backpack and your boots, but even for 2 packs, it would start to get pretty crowded, and I have trouble kind of seeing how you would actually exit the tent without stumbling either over your pole or over your gear on the way out. So there's sort of an off-the-cuff first impression of the Echo 2, and take this with a very large grain of salt because I've never actually slept in this tent overnight. My first takeaway is that it's not entirely sure what sort of tent it wants to be, if that makes sense. With the duplex, you have sort of a very straightforward, very clear idea, just a single kind of streamlined component that acts as your bathtub floor, your netting, and then your single wall structure. With here, it seems like they sort of want to compromise between the duplex and then just having a tarp and then maybe a bug bivvy on the interior. This is for people who sort of want something between that minimalist approach to shelters and then to the duplex. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. There are some awkward components. You have, for instance, you need 2 tie-out points for the doors, one for the beak, one for the interior door. You also have, for whatever reason, you have these buttons here that attach instead of the D-rings, which you have everywhere else. They feel pretty secure. I'm not entirely sure why they opted for the buttons instead of just for the D-rings like they have at the other parts of the tent. I would be somewhat worried in high winds about these getting undone and your beak coming undone. And this tent, I can already tell, again, this is my first time setting it up, but I can tell that in general it's going to be a bit more finicky to get it with a nice taut pitch if that's something you really value. So I think just based on first impressions, if you were going to go for a lightweight tent, I would probably recommend the ZPacks Duplex over the Echo 2, with the caveats that the Echo 2's moisture resistance is probably a bit stronger than the duplex, just because you do have this dual wall structure. It's sort of a hybrid between, traditional dual wall tent, which we'll see in the Fly Creek HVUL2, and between just a kind of a strictly single wall tent like the ZPacks Duplex. But if you're willing to forgo that added airflow, then I think I would recommend the ZPacks Duplex, just because it is a more straightforward tent. They actually pack down to about the same size, and the Duplex does weigh less than the Echo 2. Another thing that I would have liked to see Hyperlite Mountain Gear do, and maybe do in the future, is when I saw this tent, I assumed that because it was sort of a modular tent, you have, you know, your beak, you have your tarp, you have your inner. I assumed that the inner could be set up completely independently of the tarp. So let's say I know there's no chance of rain and I want, you know, a nice vista, I want to see the stars, I could just set up the inner with its entire mesh wall completely independently without having to set up the tarp to begin with. And having set this tent up once now, I'm somewhat suspicious that that would actually be feasible with you. Overall though, I would say these are both very good tents. I'm just getting nitpicky at this point. I think that, you know, anybody stuck with either of these would be perfectly happy, but given that you're spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a tent, I think that it's somewhat justified to get nitpicky. Alright, so I also wanted to give you guys a sense of what this shelter is like without the insert, and I have to say I actually like it a lot more without the insert. You really get kind of a 3/4 shelter. In effect, you have kind of this protection here at the front, and then you have a nice open back for ventilation. It's a little hard to see, but I have plenty of protection on my sides. I have, I would say, about a good foot or maybe even 2 feet between the end of the tarp and the end of my sleeping bag, and then, you know, maybe about a half foot between my pole and the edge of my sleeping pad. And my pad is a long and wide sleeping pad, you can see here, so this is about as sort of constraining sleeping pad wise as you'll get. And of course, if the weather is really inclement, then because I don't need to worry about the insert, I can just drop one or both of my trekking poles, particularly the rear one, to allow less sort of rain splatter to get in. Though I think if I lowered the sides, I would have little to no issues with rain splatter as well. So I have to say, if I were to actually use this shelter, I think I would probably forego the insert, just because it's more of a pain somehow than warrants. I mean, it's very hard to then sort of customize the height or drop of the shelter without then also having sort of conflicts arise with the netting, having it droop too much, or just having too much slack or rigidity in the floor and the mesh. Whereas here, you can see I have a bit more room. I don't lose any head space. I can actually sit up on my butt here, just reclining slightly. I think actually at the apex I could sit up all the way if I wanted to, because I don't lose any of this headroom that I lose to the net. You saw with the net that I have sort of a gap between the net and the side of the shelter that was, in some places, looked like it was nearly 8 inches. So while that provides some protection from condensation, you can also see it as sort of being a pretty significant loss in the total interior volume of the shelter. So I would say actually using this as a purely tarp system, I don't know, has certainly more appeal than using it as sort of an odd hybrid dual wall ultralight shelter that I'm still somewhat conflicted over how successfully it does. Okay, so what I've gone ahead and done after taking out the bug net is actually lower it down about as far to the ground as it will go. You can see I'm somewhat constrained by how low it will go because I'm already starting to lose sort of like the integrity of the beak. You can see it's already starting to slack, and when I lowered my pole even more, gaps started forming here where the beak kind of overlaps with the tarp area. But you can see I get it fairly low down to the ground at the corners. I have my pole nearly as low as it will go, with a bit of room to spare between the end of my sleeping bag and the tarp. So I imagine if I angled this against or set it up near some sort of like windbreak or something, then I would have a relatively dry night even with rain. And you can see from the inside I've plenty. Oh, just got hit by a falling little piece of bark there. You can see it's fairly flush with the ground. It's a fairly bomb-proof setup as it stands. The one thing I would like to probably point out is that if you're using this as just a tarp system, I don't think this would be a viable two-person tarp system. You can see if I had to move my sleeping pad over to accommodate a second person, we would both be rubbing up pretty close against the edges of the tent, and you'd really want to either have some sort of splash bivvy or really just use the inner. Otherwise, I think you might have some splashback issues here with rain entering under the tarp, hitting your sleeping pad, or anything else you're keeping under the tarp. So really, if you were planning on using this as just a pure tarp system, like I have it set up here, I would really stick to one person or look for a larger tarp system if you know you're planning on using this with 2 people. Alright, so last but not least, this is sort of the oddball out of the 3. This is the big Agnes Fly Creek HV UL2. The HV stands for high volume. This is sort of an update or new take on the pretty popular Fly Creek series, which is in this case a 2-person front entry tent. Unlike the other 2 here, you can see this tent does not need trekking poles. In fact, you cannot use your trekking poles at all to make this tent stand up. What it has instead is it has just a single pole system that sort of is centered around this hub right here. It's very easy to set up. Out of all 3, this took me under a minute. I mean, you really straighten out the pole, you insert the 2 ends on this corner here, you bring it around, you put this last pole in, and then you just go around the tent and you attach the little toggle system here that just attaches all around the tent. It's extremely easy to set up. And what I've done is that this is actually not considered a freestanding tent because you really need to stake out the 4 corners for it to sort of have the maximum interior space that it can. But what I've done, what I've seen other people do, is if you either have a trekking pole lying around, or here I had a carbon fiber pole that I had gotten just with another purchase. This one's a little bit too long, but what I did is I extend it, I loop it through each of the loops, including the center loop, and loop it here on the end, and then that stretches out the foot box, which in all effect makes this a freestanding tent. Again, it's maybe doesn't look as nice as if you just use stakes to tie them out, which is probably what I would do normally, but given that I'm out of stakes because I'm using all mine to stake both of these up, it's more than adequate. And you can see it's fairly taut. There's about as much room in the foot box as you would get with just using stakes. And I think for this comparison, I'm mostly going to stick to comparing the Hyperlite Mountain Gear Echo 2 to the Fly Creek because they're both somewhat similar in profile. They're both front entry tents, unlike the Duplex, which I think is really just in its own category. And I think that people looking at the Hyperlite Mountain Gear Echo 2, sorry about the truck, would also be probably wise to look at the HV UL2 Fly Creek here. In terms of weight, I can't remember the exact weights off the top of my head, but the Echo 2 is slightly lighter, although the Fly Creek HV UL2 is considered a sub 2-pound tent, which certainly makes it competitive in the overall sort of lightweight tent category. It is one of the lightest traditional 2-wall tents that you can get. I know that Big Agnes makes Fly Creek UL2 Platinum, which is incredibly expensive but weighs even less than this one by using less durable but lighter weight materials. So what you can see here is, again, I don't have stakes, but what I did is I attached my own guy line to this point and this point, and then what I do is I stake it out, which, if you can get a sense, let me grab it. If I stake it out, it pulls the 2 sides out and gives you a bit more room in the center of the tent, you can see right now there's a bit of slack there. There's more than enough room, of course, for one person, but if you want to fit 2 people comfortably, like these 2 tents, you basically need to stake out the sides. So if I were to choose between the Hyperlite Mountain Gear Echo 2 and the Fly Creek HV UL2, I think in all honesty I would probably stick with the Fly Creek. First of all, it's a lot cheaper than the Echo 2, which in this option, I didn't get it new, but in this option would cost more than $700, which is incredibly expensive for a tent. This, on the other hand, cost around $300 new. Again, I also got this tent used. No, this costs like around $350 new. I got it for under $300 new online. So it's about a half to, yeah, it's less than a half of what the Echo costs. Weighs a little bit more, but is more, I don't know, I would say it's more versatile because you can set up the interior mesh without having to set up the rain fly, which is something I was hoping you would be able to do with the Echo 2. So if you're camping under a starry, clear night, you don't need to put up the rain fly. You can really enjoy the weather. You can get kind of a full breeze rolling through your tent. And I've used this tent several nights, both by myself, and I've shared it with somebody else. And you know, like both the other tents, it's going to be a tight squeeze in that you're only going to have a couple inches between you and whoever you're sharing it with, so make sure you get along with them. But this can definitely accommodate 2 people, and with 1 person it's plenty of room. You can easily put your backpack in there if you needed to. And as you'll see in a second, I'm going to set up the rain fly just to give you a sense of what it looks like with the vestibule and kind of in storm mode, so to speak, like these 2 come by default. Alright, so here it is with the rain fly set up. What I actually did is I just took a bunch of sticks I found lying around the yard and just used those as very makeshift stakes just to really get the rain fly taut. I didn't think it was really fair to compare these 2 tents if I couldn't get this one taut as well. Because here you get a sense of the vestibule. It's significantly smaller than the vestibule afforded by the other 2 tents. You can see how there's a bit more room. Certainly you could put a backpack fairly comfortably in here, maybe even a backpack and shoes just on that one side. Whereas here, if you were even put one backpack without just really leaning it against the walls and pushing outwards, I would say that it would significantly obstruct your ability to get in and out of the tent. So keep that in mind. Again, if you're using this tent by yourself, you have more than enough room on the inside, as we'll see, for you to put your gear in with you. You can also just simply, you know, keep your gear outside exposed. Just throw a rain fly on, or a rain cover over your backpack. That's honestly what I usually do, even if it's raining fairly hard. I've never had any problems with it. So you can see one thing that you'll at least see when just looking around here is that, like the ZPacks with the rain fly, there's no real ventilation aside at the front if you just keep the door open. The ZPacks, like I was saying earlier, the only ventilation you get is if it comes down under the tent through sort of a small mesh gap there into the tent, which to a certain extent is also at play here on the Fly Creek. You can see there's a small, it's a little hard to see, but there's a small gap between the rain fly and the interior of the tent. But there's no sort of venting up at the apex. So aside from just keeping the door open, you won't really be getting too much ventilation. So if you are in a really bad rainstorm where you really just need to close the front door all the way, do expect fairly significant condensation. Of course, that's also going to be the case for the Duplex and probably for the Echo 2 if the rain's serious enough. Although the Echo 2 with the exposed back will allow for a bit more airflow. That's certainly its main advantage here. But what you can see here is that there's a bit of overlap between here where the mesh starts and then here where the fly starts. So just looking straight down, again, I don't have this pitched this taut as if I were using real stakes, but if you have this pitched fairly taut, Even in a light rain, you could essentially keep this door open all the way, because any rain that fell off would actually miss the net, the mesh here, and at worst hit this sill nylon here or hit the bathtub floor. In either case, you would stay dry. So really, if it's only a light rain, like the Duplex and like the Echo 2, you could really just leave the front door open to really maximize airflow and at least get some flow kind of from that front door. All right, so this is the inside of the big Agnes Fly Creek HV UL2. You can see there's a bit of slack because I don't have these sides guyed out. So keep that in mind when it looks like there might be less room than there could. If all the sides are staked out, you can see here I'm lying here, there's certainly enough room for a second person, although it will be somewhat tight, like I was saying earlier. Lying down all the way, you can see that there is tapering, like with the HMG Echo 2, but I would not say it's as significant. The sort of high volume design of this upgraded tent, which is not found in the original Fly Creek UL2, means that you really have steeper walls along here, particularly along the head and in the foot box, which gives a bit more room, at least I'm told, than the original design, and certainly feels like it has a bit more room. I would not be worried about my sleeping bag brushing up against the side significantly, and in the areas over here where it would touch the net or the mesh does not touch the fly, so even if there is condensation, I would not be worried about it getting on my sleeping bag or misting into the interior of the tent. I would say that for most people watching this video, this tent makes the most sense. It's a fairly versatile tent. It's appropriate to bring this tent on both casual weekend trips and on extended trips. I've seen plenty of thru hikers using this tent and other big Agnes's tents just because they're easy to set up on a platform, for instance, which is something that's much more difficult but not impossible to do with sort of pole or trekking pole suspended tents like the Duplex and the Echo 2. So in that sense, you know, if you're in a pinch, you can set this up on a platform, even though the toe box will probably be a bit smaller than you're seeing it now. But you can then also set it up on a campground, just directly on the ground if you want to as well. So you do have a bit more flexibility. And then, like I pointed out earlier, you have more flexibility in that you don't need to pitch this with the rainfly. If you knew the weather was going to be nice, or wanted to take the risk, then you could set this up without the rainfly and really get some nice views. And one thing that I really like about this tent is that on the side here, where your head is facing when you're sleeping, see, this is the front door. This is sort of a more opaque panel, so that actually isn't mesh like what you see above. So when you're sleeping and facing towards the outside, even if you're setting up near a person, you're not going to see them. You're not going to, find yourself looking out the tent right into their tent. You still get a bit of privacy. And that tapers off at the foot box, but I mean, that doesn't really matter, does it? One thing that's nice about this tent too is that you have a little stash pocket up here, which is something that you don't have on the ZPacks or the ZPacks Duplex or the Echo 2. So sometimes when I'm reading, I'll put my night lamp up here and it'll kind of illuminate the tent. Another nice thing about this tent is that these side mesh pockets here where you can put any valuables, your wallet, your phone, have them nice and accessible just in case you need them. The Duplex, I forgot to point this out, the Duplex does have mesh pockets on both ends, so on the front and the back, on the solid walls. The Echo 2, as far as I could tell, did not have any pockets, although. Alright, so there you have it. In-depth reviews of the Fly Creek, the big Agnes Fly Creek HV UL2, the Hyperlite Mountain Gear Echo 2, and the ZPacks Duplex tent. Now all of these, as far as I know, are the most up-to-date versions of the tent. The HV UL2 is the 2016 version. I believe this is a year old, but the design hasn't been updated, and the ZPacks is the ZPacks Duplex is the 2016 version. So all of what you've seen are the most up-to-date tents, most up-to-date designs, with the exception of the Echo 2 I've put in many nights in the Fly Creek HVUL2 and the Duplex, and both think they're excellent tents. All in all, I think that, you know, you would be happy with any of these tents, but they do serve different audiences. In particular, the Big Agnes is definitely more of a casual or budget hiker. I think, honestly, I will be sticking with that tent just because I can't justify having the other two tents around when I'm not doing a through hike. At these price points, these tents are great, but I do think that they are overkill for even the most casual of use, unless you're really just a gram counter or need the lightest of the lightest because of bad knees or other health concerns, in which case definitely spring for one of these tents. I would say that this tent is probably the most versatile and probably most appropriate for most of the viewers of these videos, just because of the hub pole design allows it to be set up on platforms much easier than either of the other tents. Set on the platform will lose you a little bit of room in the toe box because you won't be able to stake out those two corners, but you can always find rocks to attach the guy lines to. Whereas these two tents, I have seen people set up at least the Duplex on a platform, gotten away with it. It doesn't look pretty. I wouldn't trust it in sort of high rains or too inclement weather. The Echo 2, I think, is just too complicated to even attempt to set up on a platform. So really, you are then very reliant on finding sort of a nice big swath of land that's clear enough for you to set it up on. So my takeaway is I think I'm going to stick with the HVUL2, because even though it doesn't have the allure or prestige of human fiber or ultralight tents, which does make sense for many people, as somebody who's a very enthusiastic hiker but just doesn't have the time to go out at months at a time, I can't really warrant owning one of these more high-end tents.